So, we have our panel session now, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Times, and the question that we were presented with, how can we use stories to reevaluate and more effectively understand human nature in a time that requires a whole new way of being? How can we use stories to reevaluate and more effectively understand human nature in a time that requires a whole new way of being? And with me, we've got Amisha and Maria and Liam. And we sat together at lunchtime and had a brief chat about on this topic and decided that we would wing it. So we're just going to see where we go and how it evolves. So I'll open it up. One of you guys would like to begin with a few opening remarks, comments on that question.
Yeah, I can start. I think one way to start looking at it is what are the kind of stories that we've always told ourselves in human history. And when people break down what are stories about, they usually go for man against nature, so the struggle for survival, 4 types, man versus man. Then when we start to conquer nature and be able to have resources, we tend to start to fight against each other. Then man versus society. As societies get more and more organized, they're impressive on individual members, and individual members feels they have to struggle against the society that they're part of. And then after that, man versus himself. And it's kind of interesting, like Rachel Rose Reed's story earlier was sort of started out with a man against the society and turns into man against himself, right? That going around looking for justice and the end realizing that he wasn't capable of justice himself, and that this is where the question and our evolution ends up oftentimes, and that we're in a collective version of the same thing now, that our inability to get to that point as individuals and as groups now puts us in a situation with vis-a-vis the environment, the thing that we thought that we conquered, in these early stories that we no longer even really tell so much anymore, the struggle against nature for survival, that we have to go through the last one to actually be right about the first one. And it's really about losing struggle at all, or not being part of the stories or identifying with the stories. So I also would just submit my background is in sort of or dialogues between Buddhists and science, or Buddhist theory and science, and that I think what's great about those ancient traditions is also that they offer quite a lot of wisdom as far as touching the kind of relationship with life that we see in native cultures, but doing so outside of a day-to-day connection, so that and showing that their reason and nature don't have to be, or reason and mysticism don't have to be opposites. Right? So within some spiritual traditions, which started in places where people started to get separate from nature, that ability to balance the intellect has been honed for millennia, and we should really start looking at it more seriously. I'm glad that we are.
Thank you. One thing that I spoke earlier about indigenous wisdom, and we're familiar, I'm sure many of us, about how so many indigenous traditions have reverence at the heart of them for nature, and this knowledge of take only what you need and that sort of thing. But it was really interesting for me when I read *Sapiens* by Harari, when he mentioned that, of course, all the world's continents were covered, as it were, with megafauna at one time, heaving, as it were, and they all disappeared. And the only sort of rational explanation can be is that human beings wiped them out, in other words, indigenous people, that we basically cleared the land of all these beings. And yet now we have, such a large percentage of indigenous people who speak about reverence and care and, proper wise management. And so it inclined me to imagine that perhaps that was a learnt wisdom that emerged from having submitted to the same old human story which we're in now of hubris and overstepping the mark and just ploughing our way, digging in and annihilating this wonderful natural resource, but at some point learning and stepping back from that, which in some ways gives me some hope for now. So I'm looking at my panel and trusting that something is bubbling to the surface. That.
Okay, we'll go in linear mode. So ancient stories have preserved an ancient wisdom. They have preserved wisdom of earlier times, and they're really guide maps for humanity, and they're guide maps for survival, and they're guide maps of owning and inhabiting and really embodying the human spirit. And in that sense, they're really spiritual. And we are living at times where we have moved far beyond what these times embodied, because these times through the storytelling lived very near to the soul. And today, with our everyday distractions and with our screen kind of reality, we have moved very far away from the soul. So to move through these ancient stories is to find our way back into a soulful way of being. Stories animate the world. They bring everything back into life. And if we bring everything back into life, we can come back into relationship with everything. So the tribal act of storytelling was bringing life into the wider forces of the universe, back into communion with the individuals, but it was bringing life back into the community. Storytelling brought communities together, and communities brought storytelling. One feeds the other, and they really live in a very harmonious way with each other. One really supports the evolution of the other. Storytelling alongside stories is also really important. Who are we telling our stories to? What will our stories be if we tell stories to the earth rather than to fellow humans? What stories does the earth need to hear right now rather than what stories do we need to hear right now? What stories are emerging from the past that are bridging past with present? So the ancient stories are creating a bridge between times that have gone and the now, but they're also somehow helping us catch a glimpse of the emergent future, get a little sense of how we can move a little bit forward, a little bit further ahead. Stories are multiple, and they interweave, and they move from we have the personal, and then we have the family stories, and then we have the ideological stories, and then we have our national stories, and then we have our humanity stories, and then we have our earth stories, and then we have our cosmic stories. And it's really, we're in a vortex of stories, and who tells our stories is really important. Are our stories being told to us by others, or do we make our own stories? Do we own our stories? Do we clarify which stories serve our vital energies and our capacities as people, as species, or are our stories harming and depleting us and the planet around us? So moving through our stories aware of who tells the stories, who are the stories being told to, and what are the stories mobilizing or not, is a good starting place for discerning and creatively moving through the possibilities of stories that exist around us and inside of us.
Thanks, Maria. I was looking at the question. It says, how can we use stories? Do you think that's how it works? Do you think we, as it were, make a choice around the stories we tell, and we use this process called storytelling? Or do you think that stories emerge? Are we the storytellers, or are we simply the characters in the story?
I think we're both. I think there's a synergy that happens in the storytelling. So through the storytelling, we are told as well, rather than the story itself. So it's that sort of process of an evolving narrative. We have to embody our stories. We don't think our stories. We have to really move through our stories from the deepest place in us in order to really meet the story where it's ready to emerge. So I think what you're saying is really important. And I can only think that the movement moves in both directions and has to move in both directions.
Because when I first saw this, I was thinking, I wonder if this is just another example of our hubristic tendency to imagine that we're going to use story, as it were, that we're going to exploit story would be another way of putting it, or whether whether we are existing inside something that is so that we can't really see or touch, and that is sweeping along, whether we like it or not, and if you like somehow to put it that way. This whole phenomenon of how ideas spring up in different parts of the world at the same time. That at one time, so our stories tell us, there were many matriarchal societies, and then something shifted and they became patriarchal stories. Or then we take the ages from the zodiac, of Aquarius, that there is some energetic field within which we live, from which stories are born. So I have no answers for this, but I like the speculation around it.
Yeah, I always find it so interesting how connected our consciousness is around receiving kind of certain kinds of information at the same time. I was just interviewing a woman called Atula Bingham on my podcast last week, The Future is Beautiful. And we were talking, most of which is on the interview, but then we were talking before and after. And she actually lives in a mud home, and she just got her solar installed so that we could do the interview, and she's not really been online and connected to the culturescape that we're influenced by constantly. And as we were talking about how we are experiencing this moment in time that we're inhabiting right now, we were both saying very similar things. And then she said, wow, how interesting that how she's been completely disconnected from this sort of sense of reality and media, and that somehow the same kind of information was like landing inside of us and inside of our thoughts. And as I talk a lot about tree whispering, how I go and sit with the trees, and she talks about earth whispering, sitting with the rocks, and yet somehow we were hearing the same things. And I find that incredibly beautiful. With this question, when I first read it, what came to me was the invitation with which I was given on how to hear ancient stories. And when I think about the way that I sort of listened to modern stories, Hollywood, for example, we know that there's the stars, and there's, and then there's the baddies, and there's the extras, and, most of us will identify with the star, like, as we're watching the movie. Maybe some of you like to identify with the baddies. And so there's that sense that you're always the protagonist, you're always, like, the hero in the story, and when I started to study myth, and I was studying the myths deeply from my own ancestral culture through yoga and studying the myths of Tantra and of the Hindu gods and goddesses. And I remember very distinctly one day hearing a myth, and I think it was maybe about the goddess Durga, and I was casually identifying to her, like, warrior strength and her ability to fight all evil with the power of love. And then my teacher just sort of casually threw in there, remember when you're listening to a myth that you are every character in the story. And then you get that kind of, like, smack on your ego, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, so I'm also the evil king, and I'm also the characters that had no names, the extras, and it really taught me how to experience the world not just from my own very narrow perspective and my own kind of made-up myth of who I am and how I see the world, because I was able to recognize the different aspects of myself in all of the characters, and also recognize that some are more active than others, because as humans, we have everything, but we're not everything all at the same time, and that gave me a huge amount of empathy for what I experience in life and as I look around the world, and also it took me a little bit out of like I'm right, they're wrong, or how could they think that, or how are they doing that, because I was able to understand that I just found myself in this role in the story. And then with that, as Maria was talking about the stories of our own lives that we find ourselves in, and how all these different stories interweave, it also allows me, not all the time, but sometimes, to see myself in the other characters of the stories that I'm living out in my own reality. And that, for me, has been the great gift of myth, is sort of learning to listen in a different way.
One thing that really struck me in the years is many of the stories coming from the ancient cultures, by which I mean from the indigenous side, do not have human beings as their central. But many of the stories that I'm aware of over the last few thousand years within our religious traditions have a human figure at the center. So when those indigenous people came to me one day and they said, Matt, we've been puzzling with this question. As far as we know it, when Gautama Buddha received enlightenment, he was sat underneath the Bodhi tree. But everybody talks about Gautama Buddha, nobody ever talks about the tree. We think the tree had something to do with it. When Jesus went into the desert and came back, everybody talks about Jesus, nobody talks about the desert. When Moses went up the mountain, everyone talks about Moses. When Muhammad went into his cave, we think that it was Mother Earth speaking, but disregarded is the cave, the mountain, the desert, and so forth. And I don't know whether, Liam, do you come from a Buddhist tradition? Is that your...
Yeah. Well, okay. I can say, actually...
Let me just finish this bit. So I heard, I don't know if it's true, that after Gautama Buddha received enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, somebody told me that the first thing he did was he walked 20 paces away from the tree, then turned round and for 7 days said thank you to the tree, which I felt really good about. But, Liam.
Yeah, there's always these questions of scholarship. Did that actually happen? But I've certainly heard that, and I've certainly also heard the Buddha say, where did you learn this from? Well, the earth was my teacher. That's also commonly repeated. And of course, the whole cosmology of the time was based on cycles of birth and death that people observed in nature, and that the cycles of the human life, of being reborn, sort of your thoughts, your ego, sort of arising and passing away, and that they could somehow, that cycle could somehow be extinguished, was all drawn from observing natural cycles. So, I mean, if you really look into, I mean, this is the whole thing, is that the retelling, some people like to call Western Buddhism modernist Buddhism, because if you actually look at an old sutta, they read like legends of yore. There's, the retinues are 10,000 people. They're all perfectly enlightened. Thrones are summoned from nowhere at a whim, and you drop straight into a mythic space if you actually read them. They're not repeated because it doesn't really fall well on Western ears. But it goes back to what you were saying, that people don't believe these things. I mean, there's a great book, if anybody wants to read it, the Greeks Believe in Their Myths, by a gentleman called Paul Verne, where he talks about all the evidence that the Greeks didn't actually believe in their myths. And the same way, it's telling things in a mythic space is the way that these traditions worked. And that mythic space was full of natural elements.
How do we, I mean, the past is the past and the present is now, and now, and now. The stories that we are going to tell ourselves now, have you any thoughts, guys, on how we, what are the stories that you see emerging at the moment upon which we might be able to ride, that would carry us somewhere worthwhile into this pretty chaotic present and future?
It's the thing I was meditating on for a few days now, really sitting with what is needed and what is the medicine really that flows through the story. And there's a quote I kept aside. Pinkola Estes says that stories are like medicine, and they flow into the wound and they act as an antibiotic. They have this healing potency and they find the right place. And our wounds are quite evident. They're wounds of separateness and isolation. So I think the first very important layer for me is that the stories we need are stories of interconnection, stories that weave the personal with the collective, stories that weave the individual with the community, stories that weave humanity with nature, stories that help us realize the cause and effect of interconnectedness, that every act lands somewhere in the world and creates a ripple. And I think that's a really important learning. So how can we have stories that are wise and help us enter states of reflection and reverie? And how can we find stories that help us be with the big truths of life and create relationships with them? On that interconnectedness, I also think that we need stories that bring us into connection with the ancestral world. We walk disconnected and separate, and there's something in these tribal cultures that really have connections with the unseen, and the dead and the ancestors are always present and informing those that are here and guiding life as it moves forward. So again, it's stories of connection. It's stories that ground us in our greater belonging and can really resource us in what's happening ahead. Then there's the stories of the earth, and how can we move from the narratives of consumerism and capitalism into stories that really bring the earth nearer and make her the decisive factor for our actions and for our ways of being and moving in the world around us. So stories that are medicine are needed right now, stories that can really help us grapple with the big existential and moral questions that are emerging, and we have to find our way through.
Thank you. Amisha?
I'm feeling like I might binge watch Star Trek tomorrow, having never seen it. We can all do it together. It sounds like there's quite a take-up.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just like we're such expansive, multidimensional beings, and so we're capable of embracing like the future and technology and living with reverence for the earth and for each other. Like, we're able to do all of these things at the same time, and so I'm interested in that capacity that we have, and I feel like now I'm feeling like that's. I've started to read a little bit of like Octavia Butler, but I'm sort of behind on like really kind of understanding the future tech scenario in a not so like sensationalized way. So I feel like that's a story I want to explore more and understand.
As we've been going along, it reminded me of when I was 9, I was sent away to school because I was failing so spectacularly on all academic fronts, and my older and younger brother were excelling. And my parents, in some kind of desperate move, because they felt that I was going to end up in some school where I'd feel that I'd really failed at a pretty young age, they packed me off to this boarding school. And anyone's read William Golding's Lord of the Flies, it was like I walked straight into that book. So it was hostile and deeply dangerous place. So my first night in the dormitory, 9 years old, first time away from home, when the lights went out, you could feel the menace in the room. And it was really palpable and profoundly frightening. There was the sound of some other boy in the dormitory sobbing in bed, and I knew that an attack was going to come soon. And out of the darkness came this voice from one of the other kids, whatever they called me, I can't remember at that time. What's your story? And I knew that it was not a real question, it was just a preamble to whatever was going to follow. And somehow, I just started telling this story. And I shared that I had been raised in the bush in Africa, and that I was had this extraordinary gift of being able to communicate with animals, like lions, and I probably said tigers as well, without any knowledge that tigers don't exist in the bush of Africa. And I just, as I began telling this story, just going into it, I felt the atmosphere of the room just all quiet and still. And as I kept telling the story, and suddenly it all softened, and I realized in my mind, I thought, in my little 9-year-old mind, I thought, these are children who are missing their mums and dads and stories. Every night, for weeks, I continued these stories and protected myself with these stories. And every story would always lead to some awful situation where, I'm about to die in some quicksand or whatever, and I send out a call into the wind, and the wind carries the story to the elephants, and the elephants gather and come running to the rescue, and everything works out fine. But as I thought about it later, I thought I was telling stories of connection. I was telling stories of affinity with and relationship with and deep sort of the loveliness of being in a family, in a world that was benign and that was sort of caring, which of course these kids wanted, but also I wanted at that time to protect me, but more than that, I was almost stating at that young age an ambition for my adult life. Does that resonate? Because I deeply wanted to feel like that. And I look back now and I think I was almost giving myself a tutorial on the journey that I was later to follow, even if it wasn't quite as dramatic as being able to trumpet and make a sound and the elephants will come running. So, in our conversation, let me just go back a little bit. By the way, I didn't mention the aim of our session, understanding how humans have told their collective story throughout the ages and what kind of story we need now. Is there anybody would like to add to that thread of what kind of stories we need now?
Yeah, I think one thing briefly. So I studied a bit with the neuroscientist Ramachandran. I mean, I think the funniest thing is the best thing that he ever taught me wasn't anything to do with science. It was, he talks about motivation. He was, not a very humble man. He said, well, there's at least 4 or 5 people in this department as intelligent as I am, but they don't know how to motivate themselves. What you guys need to do, because you're sitting in your labs and you're doing these experiments and they apparently mean nothing, but I know how to tell myself stories about how I'm part of something. Other people think that reading stories about the history of science is something for old, graying, retired professors, but I think everybody should read them as soon as they start doing science, because then you feel like you're part of something. And it's that feeling, building the feeling of being part of something in a culture that's been told that they're individuals, is really the hardest thing, who are faced with a task which is so huge that every individual's part will feel meaningless. That we have to master the art of telling stories about our small place in the larger scheme of things that nevertheless makes things feel meaningful, and look to the traditions that people have been building up, like, for example, how scientists keep motivated. People in jobs already where they're always part of something small, but somehow they have a magic, that sort of follows them out of bed in the morning about life. To learn from that.
Thank you. I have a story that I think that we definitely don't need going into the future, but I was visiting a Maasai village with my wife, who's Kenyan. She's Kikuyu. And we went into this village, and there were no men about. So we just met the women, and they took us around their homes. And we went into these tiny little Maasai huts, the traditional ones, absolutely pitch black inside, with a little fire, saucepan of cow milk, and asking them questions and learning and listening. And then we visited another home, and it was an order of 20 times more prosperous and more nicely appointed than any other home that we've been in. And I asked the question, I said, why is this house so much more beautiful and lovely and comfortable than all the other houses we've been in? And then the whole group of women burst out laughing, and one of them said, oh, well, she's divorced. In other words, she doesn't have this dead weight, this man. And it was funny, and of course it was, oh, God, because the truth of the matter was, the men in that people, many of them having completely lost their way, and they're down in the village drinking. And it's the same with the Maori Tuhoi. When I asked them, what are the main issues that you're facing at this time, they said it's the men who've lost their story. The women are holding it together, but the men have lost their story. They have to find their story again. And whereas it was fun saying that the 15 to 30-year-olds can just go a bit crazy, but if they are really going crazy because they don't have a story which makes sense to them anymore, then we have a lot of trouble. And then if we go to the many of the Mohawk and Lakota reservations where we find the Ojibwe I was speaking about, I mean, they have groups of 20, 30 young people coming together, deciding they'll all kill themselves at once, and they do. So the epidemic of peoples, because it's not that we are untouched by these things, of course, it's very big within our society, and all mental illness and all of these things, of a people who have lost the stories that are somehow going to remind us of who we are and how we fit in and where our role is, what our purpose is alive on this earth. Feels to me imperative that we find the threads of that and begin to weave it one stitch at a time. And in that sense, we are all seamstresses, darners, weavers, as we each put our stitch into the cloth. So is there anything else, guys, that any of you would like to speak at this point?
I'd just like to say that it's so beautiful, and there are so many people right now weaving that story of connection. And I know you talked about the media earlier, and I wasn't in the space, so I don't know what was said, but we are kind of constantly, with the advertising that Andrew Sims was talking about this morning, and the way that the media is constantly selling us separation, fear. Now with coronavirus, we're not even allowed to look at each other or touch each. It's like there's a constant kind of get away. And through the work that I've been doing with my podcast, I have so many Trello boards just full of people that right now are weaving a story of connection, and I can't tell all their stories fast enough. And so it really does exist, and we don't even have to seek them out that deeply, but when we are exposed to more of those stories, we find more of them, and we live them, and then that takes us into a different place.
Thank you. Maria, Liam, anything to finish with?
It made me think about living storied lives and living our lives in a way where we take stock of the stories, making everything into a story, and letting everything live through the deeper layers that a story can get us in touch with. And again, on the basis of separation and individualism, the heroic narrative of stories. Most of our stories today are based on the hero's journey, an individual that goes through a descent and comes back up into the surface. And it's a very important story because I think it teaches us of the dark night of the soul and how to move through challenges. But at the same time, right now, we need to move. We need to weave. We don't need to lose the stories, but I think every story has something to teach us. But we also need to bring in stories of collaborative communities and stories that move beyond hierarchies, stories of collaboration. So again, how can we bring the collective into clearer view? How can we inform our lives by stories that weave communities together, and the resolutions and the ways forward are not based on an individual, but are based on groups of people that somehow come together.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, I think actions are important, because if stories are about something that's actually physically occurring, which, of course, then it gets easier to feel part of something larger. And if we're looking at, well, there are a bunch of people that realize that there's something deeply the matter with the way that we're living, that we're alienated from sort of the mystical intelligence that was our greatest gift, who have been responding to that in their own ways. Joseph Beuys, the guy who started the first Green Party and performance art, maybe and started doing rituals 60 years ago. Joanna Macy, Heidegger, so many people realize this at some level, and there is a movement. And if we start to identify it as a movement, and people are actually seeing the same thing, it becomes more real for every person, and every person who's doing something is part of something larger. That's where meaning comes from. So it's weaving together these stories with visible actions to create something meaningful that everybody's then part of.
Thanks, Liam. Hannah, I think we're...
Any questions? Yeah?
Hello. I was wondering if I could get maybe some perspective on the role of initiation and agency and how it relates to storytelling, because I mean, all of you guys have kind of talked about traditions, yoga, tantra, meditation, Buddhism, in which initiation is often quite integral, the idea of having someone pass down knowledge. How is it comparable to storytelling, and does it still hold true, in your opinion, nowadays? Because I've also heard a lot of talk about people saying things like, you no longer need a guru, etc., etc. So yeah, that was my question, abstract.
So I'll kick off with the reason that those young, that the Maasai men were down in the village in a way is that the initiation is now meaningless. The old initiations, as it were, that they were doing, going out and hunting a lion and all the rest of it, all these, it's faltered and it's not working. So they've lost hold of the story that used to guide them into what it might mean to take their role within that particular society. But if I think also of my stepson from my previous marriage, I mean, when he was 5, I remember him standing in front of me and his mum and dad and saying, "I'm a soldier." And this evoked a massive reaction, saying, "No, you're not. You're going to be everything except a soldier. You're going to do all these things, and eventually you'll go to university, and then you'll do a proper job." And for every year after that, he would inform everybody around that he was a soldier. And he ended up here in London. I'm down in Embercombe, and he's part of a gang and very dangerous things happening. And he called me and he said, "Can I come down to Embercombe because I'd like to volunteer and I need to separate from..." This is a young man with no initiation, okay, but wild, big energies in him. "What are you going to do after Embercombe?" And he said, I'm going to be a soldier." And I said, "Well, that'll be really interesting for Embercombe because we've never had, people come with dreams. It's not usually about joining the military." And so he comes down, and now he's US Navy SEAL. And he went the whole thing. I look at this young man, and he's an extreme example. He's a special forces soldier. How is it that our society allowed a situation that he could not find any traction anywhere to bring all of that massive energy he was holding, except that he become a Navy SEAL? Because there was there was nothing really along the way. And he just did, in many ways, I think it's an act of self-preservation, that he found the only place he could find to give him that ferocious kind of process that would enable him to form some version of the person, the human that he became. So I ask myself also, now at this time, when so many of young people floundering in terms of, if you think society is meaningless and all the aims that it seems to be predicated upon are meaningless, and where is there what's going to fill the gap? And even when it's there, how are we going to hold them during that tumultuous period of their lives to help them step into a deep and profoundly meaningful version of who they are. But these are questions. All I know is that it's really important and that we do have to do that. And that requires those of us of an adult age to begin to realize that we are called to be mentors to our young people. And that will be our challenge, because a little bit like in conversation with other people about being elders, most of the people that I know of who are of what we might imagine to be elder age are saying things like, I don't feel like an elder. I'm not quite sure what it means to be an elder. Well, we have to get over it, I think, and fumble our way there somehow.
I studied quite deeply the Bwiti culture, where there's a very strong coming of age initiation where you actually receive your life's mission, which is very connected to your soul. And in Indian culture, you have a lot of Vedic astrology readings, so there's a sense of the map of your soul and why you're here that's different to why someone else is here. And of course, we're all living in a capitalist reality where a lot of our life is about, how are you going to earn your money and your place, rather than, what's the gift of your soul bringing to the world right now. And I feel like that's the part that's missing. And something around the guru culture you mentioned is because that hasn't always actually been empowering that sense of that real connection to somebody's soul, and their soul purpose. It's created a different kind of sort of following. So I feel like initiations now, they can happen in any kinds of way. Like, we're in this kind of time where there's so many different ways. It can happen as a private moment whilst you're standing looking out at the ocean, or at 4 a.m. whilst you're sitting in your flat by yourself, but it's like, when do you get connected to that real gift of your soul?
And similar to what you're saying, I think we've lost the initiations of coming to age, and all the rituals we have around life have become quite profane and quite flat. I think the greatest initiations in life today is love and grief. These are the two portals that move us deeply into the later stage of who we are. So that's what initiation is left to today. In Jungian psychologists, they use they make a lot of use of fairy tales. And there you are, I was looking for you. So the idea is that we have put the keys of the initiation process in these stories, whether they're myths, whether they're fairy tales. And if you meditate on the stories, you see the psychological initiations one has to go through in order to reach a state of resolution, or the psychological resolutions that have to take place for one to complete the journey and complete the process. So it takes studying the symbology of these stories that really tell us how to proceed, how to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. So my question, I guess, regards the relationship between emplotment into a narrative as something that saves people, and enculturation. On the topic of Buddha under the tree, there's actually an ancient poem about the tree on which Christ was crucified from the perspective of the tree. It's a Northumbrian poem called the Poem of the Holy Rood, and it's got kind of druidic vestiges in. And another book that came out from the recently appointed Archbishop of York about the Passion narrative, and how we have all in our lives been each character in that narrative. And reading that book actually gave me a religious experience. But my question to you guys is, if we live in this, we live now in this kind of this global village, where there are so many different narratives about the beginning and end of the universe and of our lives and our relationship to the world. I mean, I work in Hounslow in special educational needs, and I'm constantly hearing Christian stories from a Muslim perspective, and often with a cadence that is entirely new and fresh, but it takes time to care about these stories at all. And especially for many people my age, I want to care, but sometimes I can't, because, you know, church bells and certain hymns might have emotive resonances with me, but the call to prayer, for example, as much as I consider it beautiful, because I haven't been encultured into that, may never in the same way. And so my question is, it's not often that we don't care, but it's that we actually can't care for all the panoply of data in our global village, in our metropolis. And so how do we find time to study these things and care about these things in a world which has, in the words of the late Mark Fisher, increasingly functioned to produce a scarcity of time? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start with that. I think basically the whole organization that I work with is something of a effort to get started on answering these things. Is just we Art Earth Tech. We help to create living spaces for people to spend more time together. And I think the idea is, and there's a number of other people that are looking at that, but that you have to actually spend time with people, and that it's a bit like going back to the initiation thing, that the initiation you have to be sort of part of a group that is saying you're part of our story in order for the initiation to care. And it has to be a real group that you can look at and see and feel, and real humans that you feel part of. And part of I come from an obligation Catholic family, and part of what always felt hollow for me with those rituals, is that nobody really seemed to care very much. You know, a lot of people were just going through the motions. People were not very invested in the stories anymore. They just didn't have anything new. And so really it is, I think, really being culturally creative. I mean, the very difficult question that we have to just face up to is that we need to be culturally creative. We sort of ran into a space where our religious structures that we used to have had an encounter with science, and it didn't go very well for people's ability to invest themselves in those stories. And we haven't quite recovered yet. We lost the respect for the mystical capacity of humans as part of that process. And we need to go and get it back. And that involves really creating new groups, that admit people as part of the membership and say you're part of our story now. And that's, what we need to do. Right?
A guy called Chief Oren Lyons is of the Iroquois Confederacy. He's 90-something years old now, but he was repeating one of their prophecies. He said, one of the prophecies goes that when the weather goes crazy and the big winds begin to blow and people no longer love their children, will be the final confrontation when it is decided whether we have a future or not. And in their opinion, we are at that time now. He said, and people just don't care. And so in my work of going different parts of our world, but also a lot into the corporate world, as well as to universities and activist groups and all over, is what are the stories and the way of being that I can take to those places where I can somehow cut across or find a way through the numbness and the not caring. And which is why I have put so much effort and investment into the whole notion of the children's fire, which for the risk of repeating for those who already know it, but a long time ago, chiefs, women and men, sat together and asked the question, how shall we govern our people? Because we've come to understand that the leaders, once they get used to sitting in their seat of leadership, begin to make judgments and decisions which favour rather more the leaders than they do the people that they're in service to. And they came up with the idea, what can we do that would encourage our leaders to remember what is important and to be leaders in the way that we would like them to be. And someone came up, or somehow the idea emerged, that every time the Council of Leaders would gather, they would kindle a little fire at the centre of the Council of Chiefs. And every council chief would have to make a pledge to the children's fire. And that pledge went, no law, no decision, no action, nothing of any kind will be permitted to go out from this circle of chiefs that will harm the children. And when they said that, they didn't just mean human children, but the young of all kind. In other words, it is a pledge to life. Now, I've taken this to China, to India, to different countries, and all kinds of different cultures. But I feel it's in that sort of language, this is where we need to begin, because we do still, even if we're very imperfect at it, imagine that we still love our children. Let's sort of work on that hypothesis. It does touch us. So when we speak to people about their love of their children, we are speaking to the very core of, do they really still love life? Because if we don't, any species that no longer loves its children has already signed away its, there is no future. And it moves people, it touches people, because along with it comes the challenge, and I would offer it to all of you, all of us here, myself included. A seat at the council awaits you. You are a chief in waiting. You are invited to take a seat in this council, and you are invited to take the pledge of the children's fire. No law, no decision, no action, nothing that you will do will in any way harm the children and the future that they will occupy. And then you reverse that round and you say, everything that I do, every decision, every move I make, I will find the courage to bring forward my gifts and contribute towards a society that does care. So I feel we have to cut to the chase, we have to get to the core, and then we have to be brave. And the lovely thing about that, it's not martyrdom. That brings joyfulness, because we have given ourselves a purpose. And we have to begin with ourselves. Do I care? And usually the answer will be yes, but not wholly so. So how do I find myself to the very core where I can stand next to that children's fire and know that I fully own that seat? I hope that in some way it gives you something for your question. I suspect we need to finish.
Yeah, I'm going to be... we're going to have to cut off now because we're about half an hour out, if that's okay. But if you do have any more questions, feel free to come and find our panellists and talk to them personally. So thank you to our panel.